Welcome. I hope you've been enjoying the series that we're having with Dr. Mahadio Sukai, who is a low vision scientist. Please go back and watch his previous videos, but today we're going to dive into his actual career. So Mahadio, you have a wide variety of experiences in your scientific career. So please lay it on me. What is your scientific career? Maybe sticking to the highlights.
Non-linear. That would be the highlights. No, I joke. So my undergrad training is in molecular genetics and molecular biology. My master's was in molecular pharmacology. And my PhD in cancer biology. I'm a cancer geneticist ultimately by doctoral training. My postdocs, I did cancer genomics and experimental therapeutics, and then I ended up in genome diagnostics for a few years as a junior staff scientist before evolving away from there. So my career has gone from the basic science all the way out to the translational clinical human science, and over time I've had the chance to sort of see kind of the clinical trial side of things, the process to application side of things, or the pilot to process to application side of things. I've been engaged in therapeutics and drug development approaches. I've been engaged in genomics and proteomics. I've been engaged in animal models. I've been engaged in human research. I've been engaged in a whole bunch of different things in a whole bunch of really, really meaningful ways. And at the end of all of that, what I knew I really gravitated to the most was the population data science aspect of the work that I had done, particularly in genome diagnostics, and from population data science into sort of social determinants of health and public health research. And what's been particularly of interest to me over the last few years has been how many different research studies will often, for whatever reason, leave out, not necessarily deliberately, but leave out swaths of the human population, and those swaths might be, well, we're not going to think about things geographically. Perhaps we should have. We're not going to think about things through a lens of disability or chronic health condition. Perhaps we should have. We're not going to think about things in the context of biological sex. Perhaps we should have. We're not going to think about things from a perspective of sort of ethnicity and culture, which are tied to geography. But perhaps we should have, right? And so when I started to see some of those things sort of materialize in the context of genome diagnostics and genome variant interpretation, which is what I did for a number of years, I also became interested in trying to understand, well, how would this level of thinking also apply in the context of, for example, social determinants of health for human populations, particularly persons with disabilities. In parallel to that aspect of my scientific career, I became interested very early on, because I got slapped with the label very early on of being the low vision scientist, but also being the first one that people had heard of or interacted with, and I was this sort of weird unicorn that kept getting identified as a weird unicorn. And I kept saying, my job is to be a scientist. My job is not to be the low vision scientist, right? And people kept coming back to the identity or the label, and not in a bad way, but just in a way that meant that was how I got seen, for want of a better word. And so I became very curious, intensely curious, as to why was I the first one? What were the success factors, environmental or personal, that facilitated that for me, while so many others who might have been just as smart and just as capable just didn't do it, right? And went and they did something else. And so I started to spin out and generate a parallel research career around STEM, and around understanding persons with disabilities in STEM. And so I did work on the graduate student experience. I did work on the postdoctoral experience. I did work on understanding journeys and career pathways through STEM and into STEM for persons with disabilities. I did work on the accessibility of post-secondary education, first at the graduate and postdoctoral level, for persons with disabilities, and then also at the undergraduate and college level. I did work on the accessibility of employment. I did work on STEM research and training spaces, and ultimately I'm doing work on organizational systems and the accessibility of organizational systems, particularly as they relate to STEM, in order to understand what makes them accessible, what doesn't make them accessible, why would someone succeed or not succeed within these environments, and how you can actually modify that to foster success. And those two career tracks, those two research studies have been conducted in parallel, not in sequence. Um, and so when I describe my career path to people, people think I'm like 80 years old, which is always quite funny. And so the interest for me is the recognition that often people get left out of our thinking, and often persons with disabilities get left out of our thinking. And whether that thinking is around social determinants of health, public health, around employment and education, or around, you know, things relevant to, for example, diagnostics and human biology and disease, or, you know, people get left out of our thinking in terms of how organizations are built and how systems are put together. And so over the course of 20 some odd years, my scientific interests have shifted. And you know, if anyone said to me, you know, could you actually be a geneticist again, my answer would be twofold. One is I never stopped being a geneticist. But also two is, could I go back to the lab? No, because it's been a while, right? Also, that's not where my interest is these days. My interest is in much more of the population data science angle, and much more understanding the nuances in what happens when we forget about people, right? Um, and so I think, and I talk a lot about how we do inclusive research, how we do inclusive training, right? I think, and I talk a lot about what it actually means to do science and be a scientist, and how are these things that we think about going to need changing as time goes on.
So we've discussed before on some of the other videos what some of your accommodations are, but what are your accommodations to be a successful scientist?
So in the beginning, the technical help to do some of the fine motor skills that I am not physically capable of doing, right, was a large part of my accommodation or accessibility support set. Um, uh, for a large hunk of time, I needed computer-aided microscopy, which of course now is default. But when I was in graduate school, computer-aided microscopy was expensive and very much not a default. I needed live microscopy, like real-time image capture. And then I also needed, and still need to this day, something that would actually work in the context of statistical and bioinformatics data analysis packages, so that I can actually read the spreadsheets properly. And in theory, that's a screen magnifier. In practice, it's a very, very, very large screen, because I find that magnification software doesn't interact well with statistical analysis packages or bioinformatics packages. And I've had multiple experiences where those two software suites just have caused machines to crash very painfully, very unfortunately not fixably. As in, the IT department couldn't figure out how to make the machines not do that. So the only solution, ironically, was simply not to turn one of the software packages on, either not turn the magnification package on, or not turn the bioinformatics or statistical analysis package on. But if you're supposed to use these things, and you're supposed to use these things in concert, that's a problem. So what I ended up gravitating to was large monitor and modifying the default settings within whatever it was program I was using to make things big and readable to me. Because for me, things need to be high contrast, they need to be big. So font size has to be large, cell size has to be large, numbers have to be written cleanly, like things have to look large for me to interact with them. So like at one point in my office in the last job I had, we'd mounted a 60-inch TV to the wall on a articulated arm and plugged my laptop into it.
Oh, wow. That is a big screen.
Yes, but here's the funny thing. It was also 6 inches away from my nose, right? Because that's how it needed to be, Kate. Uh,
Mhm.
and it's funny because there's rules against that sort of thing in a lot of places because that's not ergonomically friendly, apparently. And I've actually run afoul of some of those rules where the things that I needed from an accessibility support perspective were so far outside of the defaults that that people just couldn't figure out ways that they could actually work together. Right? I have a story I could share with you about that, but it'll go on for a while, and so I won't share it unless you really want me to.
I mean, how good is this story?
It is painfully entertaining, and it illustrates, I think, the number of ways that accessibility supports can often be misinterpreted in the context of the sciences, or in the context of workplace rules generally. And so I do find that it is worth telling. Um,
You started, so you need to finish. You need to give me the story.
Okay, so when I actually became a junior staff scientist, once I'd finished my 2 postdocs, I had gone to, with the permission, and permission is the wrong word, with the foreknowledge and blessing of my boss, who was also my she previously was my PhD supervisor, and so she'd asked me to come back and help her set up the genome diagnostics facility at the University Health Network in Toronto. And so with her foreknowledge and blessing, I went to occupational health and human resources to start the conversation around disability related workplace accessibility supports for myself. And it was entertaining because they didn't really know how to deal with that. The policies around workplace accessibility supports had always been, if you're injured on the job or you were ill and you're coming back to work and you needed time off, and they weren't really set up for persons like myself who came into the workplace with pre-existing lived experience with disability. And so I was asked for my documentation, which I provided, and they sent me an ergonomist. And I said, why are you sending me an ergonomist? And they said, every disability accommodation at work here goes through an ergonomist. And kind of mentally shrugged to myself, and I was like, okay, fine, sure, you need to send me an ergonomist, send me an ergonomist. And so the ergonomist came to my office at like 7:30 on a Monday morning, which is half an hour after I showed up in the office. And he said, show me how you work. And so I sat in my desk chair, pulled my laptop close to me, right? Hunched over the keyboard, stuck my nose against the screen and started typing. And he said, okay, what you need to do is you need to sit straight in your chair. I said, sure. He said, put your wrists on the desk in front of you. I said, sure. He said, push the keyboard of the laptop back so that your wrists will rest on the front of the keyboard and your fingers will rest on the keys. I said, fine. He said, keep your back straight. I said, fine. He said, okay, good. You're done. I said, no, I can't actually see the screen. He said, all right, we'll get you a flat screen monitor for your laptop. I said, now we're talking. What are you thinking, a 30-inch, 40-inch? He said, 19 inches. I said, why so small? He said, you can't actually turn your neck when you're reading a computer monitor. It's going to cause repetitive stress syndrome in your neck. I said, huh, that's interesting. I have this thing called nystagmus, which basically means my eyeballs jiggle. It's like Mad Eye Moody syndrome. And they both jiggle. And so I can't physically control them from jiggling unless I give myself a migraine. And so I'm not going to give myself a migraine every minute of the day, every day of the week when I'm actually trying to do my job. And so I said to him, I turn my neck as a matter of course when I'm reading. I have always done this. If there was repetitive stress syndrome to be had, I guarantee you it would have been had when I was 5. he looked at me blankly and gawped like a fish for a little bit of time, and then he said, "I don't know how to help you." I said, "Well, I can tell you how to help me. You can get me a large screen." And to his credit, he tried to problem solve. He tried to figure out an accessibility support that would work. But the problem, and I realized this only belatedly, the problem was that he wasn't trying to figure out an accessibility support that would work for me through the lens that I needed. He was actually trying to figure out an accessibility support that would work through the lens of ergonomics, because he could not get around that repetitive stress syndrome in the neck. He kept trying to imagine a way where I could have what I needed so that I wouldn't have RSS, right? Meanwhile, I didn't care about RSS because I had been living with having to turn my neck every time I read something ever since I started to read. And so for me, it wasn't an issue, but for him, it was the issue. The issue for him wasn't me being able to read. The issue was me being able to read without RSS. And so he kludged together this incredibly complicated accessibility support that got shot down by the institution. And remember, in the first conversation we were having, I was telling you that sometimes it's actually a curse to be to be so good at navigating the space that I don't always need accessibility supports or don't always need aids or devices. And this is one of those cases where it was a curse, because my boss knew I didn't need a 50-inch monitor embedded in a table with a glass surface, so, and angled appropriately so I could actually see the thing and have a standing workstation. She knew I didn't need that. She knew I just needed a 30-inch monitor, right? And so when she was presented with this accessibility support that she would have had to pay for because those are the rules, right? She said, no, he doesn't need that. And so instead of the whole thing getting reset and somebody saying, well, what do you actually need, Mahadio? I actually got nothing.
Mm.
And what made it worse is that HR systems, I'm going to say something extremely blunt, even blunter than swearing.
Ooh.
HR systems in most large organizations are built along the premise that the person with the disability is trying to fake it.
Ooh, that's controversial.
Very. Right? Go and look at all the policies, right? All the policies come from the scenario of somebody on an assembly line making widgets, injuring themselves, and getting put on furlough for a bit while they heal. And then all the policies are set up so those people who are supposed to make widgets, who are measured on the number of widgets they make per hour, are brought back to make widgets at that same rate as before. And the policies are set up in such a way so that the insurance companies don't want fraud. And so all the policies are calibrated to the return to work at widgets per hour, whatever they're supposed to be, right? And so the systems are predicated on a risk calculus, which is that the person with the disability is lying.
That's just sad.
Right? But that's how the system is built. The system is built on a notion that I have to prove what I need when I need it in order to get it, right? And there's all sorts of human rights law that have tried to mitigate this basic premise, but nobody's actually tried to do away with this basic premise, because the basic premise is based on the injured worker, not on the disabled worker, right? And with absolutely no offense to any injured worker who is out there, in the 1920s, when injured workers really started to, post World War I, post Industrial Revolution, post Union, really become something within the workforce and a population that organizations and insurance companies needed to start to think about. Persons with disabilities who were born with disabilities like myself, we would have been institutionalized and sterilized, right? We wouldn't be in the workforce. But today, and we would certainly not be doing science that way, although there are a number of scientists with disabilities from that era who were scientists with disabilities who you never knew lived with disabilities until much later, right? But those are the rules that are actually applied to persons with disabilities in the workforce today. Because the persons with disabilities who were born with disabilities who were going into the workforce really started to do that in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And somebody said, hey, we have disability policies that already exist. Let's just apply them. Never bothered thinking about them.
Yeah, they need to be, they have been reworked, right? They're different now.
No,
Oh,
no, they're not.
okay.
Easy to think that they are, but they're actually not. And this is one of the things that drives the interests that I have from a research perspective, right? Because everyone's a human being, but not all human beings have the same lived experience, even if they're from or part of the same quote unquote community, right? And so remember I said in video 1, somebody else with low vision would have had a different experience than me, right? So you could take all the blind people and you could lump them together, and you could say, well, this is the mathematical blindness in education, in employment, in healthcare, whatever. But in reality, you've got folks with vision loss who are born with vision loss. You've got folks with vision loss who acquire vision loss in adulthood. You've got folks with vision loss who acquire vision loss over the age of 65, right? And they all have different lived experiences. I'll tell you a story. My father had cataract surgery in the middle of the last decade when he was 75 years old. And obviously the first thing that he had to give up before he could have cataract surgery was his driver's license. And Dad said to me, son, I feel like I'm in jail. I said, why, Dad? He said, well, I can't drive a car. And I said, Dad, I haven't been able to drive a car my whole life. Are you telling me I'm in jail? And my father, bless his soul, said, yes, but you're used to it. Right? and the thing is that it had never crossed Dad's mind that I, who had no experience of driving a car, could ever want to drive a car or would ever need to drive a car because I was used to it. Right? As far as he was concerned, him not being able to drive a car was the end of the world. Right? And so when we think about the nuances of lived experience, we don't think about these kinds of nuances. We don't think about the nuances that say that the experience of disability is not the experience of disability for everybody, because it matters what disability group you identify as belonging to, or groups you identify as belonging to. It matters how old you are when you come into your experience. It matters how you're interacting with the world. It matters what assistive tech you're using. It matters what environment you're in. And it matters the functional specificities of your lived experience. And all of those things dictate the terms of engagement between a person and their environment. And workplace policies, unfortunately, don't take those sorts of things into consideration as well as they should. And so that specific story I told of what happened when I was at my previous employer, absolutely a true story, right? Unfortunately, a very painful story, because I think the way that the request got presented up the food chain and how it got handled and how it got managed ended up leading to, I'm going to say, a breakage of relationships that I didn't recognize until much after the fact. Right? And the thing is, I knew better because I know the space, but I wasn't allowed to influence it. Right? And if I had been able to influence it, things would have been, I would hope, very different, or they might have ended up the same way. Right? But this is STEM employers, right? This is STEM employers who don't know any better, who are adapting rules that they're told are the right ones to adapt.
But you would think that because we're in STEM and we do experiments, we come up with hypotheses and we test them, it would be somewhat easy for someone to say, okay, let's figure out what the accommodation is. And if there isn't a precedent, then we do a little experiment. We move things around, we see how it goes, and then we keep changing it until it's improved.
But you see, the problem is the people who are running the HR departments at post-secondary institutions and research institutes and large STEM employers are not scientists. The people who are running HR departments are HR professionals.
Well, that is true, but you would assume, maybe I'm being naive, that the top person in any university or research institute would hopefully be a scientist.
Mm-mm.
So they could inform HR, we are going to do the
No,
um,
but I think the problem is, and I remember I've sat in an executive C-suite for a number of years now as well, right? So I understand how things work like this. So there's a lot of delegated authority, right? And so unless you do something like write an obnoxious letter to a hospital CEO to say that your workplace accommodation policies are shite, which I have done, right? On behalf of somebody, I did do that. But unless you actually write that letter to the CEO, right? The CEO has delegated the authority for a case like mine to the chief of people and culture. The chief of people and culture has delegated it to somebody on their staff, and it never actually makes its way to a scientist who says, "Wait a minute, there's something wrong here," right? And so I think the problem ends up being that if you are somebody who has a lived experience, who knows the system, who understands how the system does and doesn't work, and you're like myself, who's a subject matter expert in accessibility in the sciences, and who's a subject matter expert in accessible employment, and who's a subject matter expert in accessible education, I know the million ways that this should work properly. And I know the billion ways, and we can do this the British way with 12 zeros, right? Where it doesn't work properly, right? Another story that's still unspooling, and I'm happy to share this one and deal with the consequences of the sharing of it later. So I'm teaching a course at a university in Southern Ontario. Ironically, the course is about accessible by design workplaces, because I am a nationwide subject matter expert in the field of accessible employment. I chair the Employment Standard Technical Committee for the branch of the Canadian federal government that writes these things, right? And so I developed a course, and I'm teaching a course to a bunch of undergrads on accessible by design workplaces, and I got my sessional contract, and I can't read it because it came in an inaccessible PDF, right? And I wrote back saying, I can't read this contract. Can you actually send me a version that I can read in a format that I can interact with? And this got referred to Human Resources. And the last email I got from Human Resources basically said, by requesting an accessible version of the contract, are you declaring that you need disability-related accommodations? And I wrote back saying, why don't we just have a phone call? Because otherwise, I'm going to tell you I'm a subject matter expert, and I know this a lot better than you do. And I've written the standard on the subject, and it's your job to give me an accessible contract for me to read and sign. It's not my job to declare I need an accessibility accommodation in order for you to do that, right? But the rules are, we can't provide accessible things until somebody declares a need for them,
I
right?
mean, I don't understand what the problem is. You just asked for an easier document. Just
But that is the problem. I asked for something that is not provided. In order for it to be provided, I need to fill out paperwork that I also can't read.
so like, is that necessary? Because you can do if you don't need any other accommodations from them, it's just one thing.
And I don't. I just need to be left to teach my course in peace, right? But at the end of the day, right, the rules are not built for the scientists with disabilities. The rules are built for the manufacturing assembly line worker who injures themselves making widgets.
I have no words. That's scary, and I'm very naive because I did not know that.
The problem is, and I don't mean for this to sound offensive, the problem is that most people don't know it. And then most people don't think about it because they think the experts know it, right? And with all love and respect to the experts, some of whom are friends of mine, um, they 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 didn't grow up within this space to
Mm.
know it or to understand it. And they don't bother asking the questions to people who do, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I will say that, and we've talked about this before, when I went to ABRACAMS last year, I went and listened to a panel of individuals who are talking about having disabilities in STEM and their lived experiences. And one of them said something, and hopefully she will be appearing in videos after you, but she said, anybody can become disabled at any point in their lives. So, everybody should take an interest and help each other if this is the case, because it could, you could be in an accident tomorrow and something will happen.
So
And I never thought
yes,
that way.
that is true. I'm going to push back against that statement though. The person who is 55 years old who has sciatica and is starting to lose their hearing and is starting to lose their vision because of diabetic retinopathy or age-related macular degeneration has a different relationship to disability than the person who is 35 and gets injured on the ski hill. And the person who's 35 injured on the ski hill has a different relationship yet again to the person who was born with their lived experience. Right? So yes, anybody can become disabled at any point in time. And so absolutely accessibility matters to everybody. Right? It matters to everybody also because frankly, the wheelchair ramp is also beneficial if you're a parent carrying a stroller.
Mhm.
Right? And the large print signage is beneficial to frankly anybody who can't read size 5 anything. Right? But more than that, the quality of that lived experience is different across those possibilities and across those probabilities. So it's the person who's 55 who's losing their hearing, losing their mobility, losing their vision. For them, it's a health issue, right? For me, it's a characteristic. It's never going to be a health issue for me. It's never going to be a characteristic for the 55-year-old. Right? And that's also what we forget about because when we think about disability, we always think about it as a health outcome, right? We always think about it as this thing that perhaps could be rehabbed or cured or treated, that society is conditioned to treat disability that way, right? But there's a whole cadre of human beings who were born with congenital this or congenital that, right? For whom this has been our experience from day one. We don't know another experience, right? Before I got on this call with you, I had to run to the hardware store, and the Uber driver said to me, are you going to pick up your car? I said, no, I'm not going to pick up my car. I'm going to run an errand. And he said, well, don't you have a driver's license? I said, no. And then what followed was a series of increasingly invasive questions about why I don't have a driver's license.
It's none of his business.
Well, that's also true. But at the end of the day, I don't have a driver's license because I can't get one. It reminds me actually of an erstwhile date I once had who had equally invasive questions about why I don't have a driver's license. She was a social worker. Right? But society's assumptions and predispositions around disability and accessibility are built around the notion that it's this age-related thing to be cured, right? Or this accidental or injury thing to be rehabbed. But for some of us, it isn't.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There is the lengthy biology lesson from video number 1. There is absolutely nothing that I can do, and this has been true since I was very young, to physiologically correct my eyesight, aside from spectacles that only go about a third of the way, right? If even that, and nothing neurologically that I can do, right? So this is my experience. It's the experience of a lot of people. Well, not just my experience, but the notion of disability is the experience of a lot of people in a lot of different ways, right? And what STEM has done remarkably well, what things like medicine and law and a bunch of other disciplines have done remarkably well is if you are a person who enters the discipline and then acquires a lived experience, you are taken care of, right? With all due respect to the lived experience of those individuals, that's not the problem. The problem is that for those of us whose lived experience predates going into the field, we are not taken care of, right? We're not envisioned to be part of the space. And so the activation energy, the barrier to entry is much, 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 much greater, right? The system is set up to provide large print to somebody who's, experiencing age-related macular degeneration. The system is not set up to provide large print to me, but isn't it easy to just make everything large print? Therefore, everybody has it.
Yeah.
But we don't do that, Kate.
I mean, that doesn't sound hard, but then again, I think I'm just showing my naivety.
Well, so the challenge is it doesn't sound hard, but the reason that it's not done is because how do you know that the large print that Mahadio needs is going to work for the 55-year-old with age-related macular degeneration? And the answer is you don't, right? But if you have set up something that is, instead of size 8 Calibri, right, you set up something that's like size 14 Verdana, right, then you are guaranteed that the number of people who are going to call your office and say, I need a large print document, is going to go way down, right? And if you actually ran the math, you would figure out that because so many fewer people are actually asking for it, because you have anticipated something and met most of those people halfway, then life is better off. You can spend the money you would have spent on making custom large print documents, you could spend it on something else, like a more effective use of your time.
And I think this is just showing my privilege, because this is a whole bunch of stuff that I've never had to consider. Because yes, I do wear glasses, but I can read everything.
Yeah, I mean, what are your prescriptions?
Oh gosh, you would laugh. I have astigmatism, and they're tiny. They're tiny. I don't even. I
That
think
that's okay,
I
right?
might even be one. Like it's nothing.
Right. And so I've met people who are very proud of their +5 or -5 prescriptions being very strong, and I start laughing, and they say why, and you're like, -17 and a half, right? So, strong is relative. But
My glasses wouldn't help you, Mahadio.
no, they wouldn't, and in fact, mine wouldn't help you at all. They would completely distort your vision,
Hmm.
right? And so the thing is, like, these are not complicated things necessarily to do, but the system doesn't permit the doing of them, because the system is set up in such a way so that um, it is a lot of it is about risk management, and a lot of it is about is about allowing the person with disabilities to actually ask for what they need. But here's the other interesting thing, and then you might want to cut me off after I say this, and because I don't know how long we've been on this topic. But now, if you are a STEM trainee with a disability, and you've done undergraduate education, and most of your experience has been in the classroom, and you're moving into a working lab environment to do your PhD, you are going to be asked when you declare, what do you need? Right? What is the likelihood, do you think, that that student knows an answer to the question?
Ooh, yeah, that's a great question, because my dyslexic student knew that they needed extra time for their tests and exams.
Different issue, though, right?
Yeah.
So in the context of a lab meeting, what would that student need? In the context of an oral exam, what would that student need? In the context of doing lab work when you've got a protocol book handy, what would the student need? They wouldn't know necessarily,
Hmm.
right? They could say, well, let's start with the extra time, right? But then who's going to check in with them? Who's going to make sure that's working?
That's a good question.
right? This is the real barrier with respect to persons with disabilities in STEM. The only way we're going to actually know what we need is to try and figure it out. And the only way that people are going to be responsive to that is if there's a mechanism in place to say, let's attempt this, and as you said earlier, let's attempt this and experiment with it and observe how it's working, observe how it's not, then address it and then move on. Right?
Yeah, it honestly doesn't sound hard.
But that's not how
It
the
just needs,
written.
it just needs someone to take ownership of it. Like, it shouldn't be all on the disabled person to self-advocate,
Yeah,
because that's what it is saying, you know, I need something, and then it sounds like you just have to be the squeaky wheel, like, I still haven't got it, it's still not working.
that's right.
And I'm sure eventually they might just get irritated and say, we're done.
And that does exactly happen. Right? And in retrospect, it has happened to me twice.
Mm.
Right? Theoretically, it happened a third time because before Aaron Shimmer took me as a postdoc, I had applied elsewhere, and once it became clear to that potential supervisor what I needed, the rejection that I got came only after he did not secure funding, or so he said to me. Right? And I have in the moment no reason to disbelieve anyone's words when they say, well, I didn't get the grant, so I'm not taking the postdoc. In that particular case, it might have been, I didn't get the grant, so I'm not taking the postdoc and the required lab tech, or I don't have the money to pay for the required lab tech, so I'll just pass it off on not having the grant. Right? Most accessibility supports for scientists with disabilities don't cost a whole lot. Right? The support mechanism, on the other hand, the let's actually try, figure it out, figure out what will work, what won't work, modify, like the process
Mm-hmm.
is time consuming. The process is individualistic. It has to be, right? Because there's only so many ways that you can in advance think about how to make quote unquote science accessible. Right? The accessibility of science comes from adaptability. It comes from innovation. It comes from flexibility. Right? It comes from communication. It comes because people will talk to each other and say, this is not working, let's try something else.
It sounds like something people in STEM should be awesome at.
Should be.
Okay. Well, why don't we leave this one there, because we have an awful lot more to discuss. So thank you for joining us on today's journey. Join us next time, where we are going to be delving into Mahadio's vast volunteering experience and advice that he has to give if you also want to volunteer. So thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.